If you're a Resident Evil fan, you probably know that the series' true beginning isn't the 1996 PlayStation original, it's a 1989 Famicom game called Sweet Home. What you probably didn't know is that Resident Evil 1 was then released for the Famicom anyway. In 2003. What?
Well, not officially, of course. Brought to us by Mars Production, this is actually a weird backport Chinese bootleg of the original Resident Evil, made for Famicom hardware. And it's impressive and cute enough that I wanted to make a little video about it for you guys. Now, I played this using an English fan translation patch credited to Pack and Sack Dave on romhacking.net, so thank you very much, because I, despite everything, cannot read Chinese, and that would have made playing this significantly more difficult. The game contains the opening cutscene of the original, faithfully recreated in all of its 8-bit glory, using sprites instead of actors. Although the dialogue is a little confusing to follow because there's no indication of who is speaking, and as for the translation itself, I have to assume that this English translation is accurate. I can't check it myself since I don't understand Chinese. But if you're familiar with Resident Evil 1 like I am, this is an entertaining read because it's like the script of Resident Evil got thesaurused into a very slightly different version. The recognizable lines are still there, but slightly different and slightly off. We very quickly get control of Jill, who is the only playable character in this version of the game. Chris's campaign is absent entirely. We strut through an adorable recreation of the dining room, and towards the first zombie encounter where it's revealed, this game borrows the Gaiden combat system, where you need to time your input with an indicator swinging back and forth in order to successfully hit your target. That probably makes some of you flinch, because Gaiden doesn't have the best reputation ever. I'm actually not much of a Gaiden hater myself, so I found this combat system perfectly serviceable. As far as recreating classic survival horror combat and resource management goes, I think they were onto something. You may also notice that the basic zombie sprite here is directly lifted from Gaiden. This is still a Chinese bootleg after all, a lot of the assets are just lifted from other games wholesale. After dealing with the first zombie, we back out to the main hall, and once again we get a fairly faithful recreation of what happens in the original game, with Jill and Barry searching for Wesker in the main hall. Once that conversation concludes, you are fully let loose in the mansion, and what follows is a surprisingly one-to-one conversion of the entire campaign of Resident Evil. This really impressed me, because usually bootlegs are sort of weird, janky, incomplete representations of the games they've poorly stolen assets from, but just about every single set piece and puzzle is represented here. Pushing the statue off of the upper level of the dining hall, that painting puzzle, collecting various keys to open various doors, the entire mansion is represented room for room, with a kind of disturbingly impressive level of detail, down to exact counts of enemies and their locations within said rooms. This is a level of effort that transcends bootleg and just sort of becomes an unofficial demake of the game. Like, if this were put on itch.io instead of released on the NES in 2003, I think it'd be pretty popular as a cute novelty. Now, it's not perfect, we'll get to that, but the initial impression was positive enough that it left me with a question. Why does this even exist? And well, it turns out there's actually a lot of complicated reasons for this, but this is the second channel, so I'm going to keep it very brief. In short, replicas of the Famicom hardware, so-called Famiclones, are quite common all over the world in regions that didn't have ready access to the genuine NES, and they're not even that uncommon even in places that did. But they were particularly prevalent in China, especially in the 2000s when the region had an explicit ban on all video game consoles. So enterprising Chinese businesses worked around this by creating Famiclone hardware and marketing them as educational computers that just so happened to have a Famicom cartridge slot on them. These Famiclones take many forms depending on the region, and even in China themselves there's tons of these. I could make an entire 50-minute video about these if I wanted to, but I don't. Stay on target. In fact, Nintendo's patents on the hardware expired sometime in the mid-2000s, so it wasn't even illegal to do this. All in all, this meant there was a market for these weird NES backports of more modern games. And this Resident Evil port isn't even the only one of these, far from it. Mars Production themselves made tons of them. Final Fantasy VII NES is probably the most famous of these, but there are so many. But this video's only about this one, and now we know it exists to fill a niche in the Chinese market. Back to the gameplay. The basic flow of exploring the mansion works almost identically to how it does in the PlayStation 1 original, with all the same puzzles and items being present, although you really do need to have the entire flow of Resident Evil 1 memorized to get much done with this bootleg, because this game doesn't offer a whole lot in the way of hints or cutscenes in order to direct you from place to place. Once you're out of the intro, cutscenes pretty much stop existing, and you can't examine objects in this game. So unless you already know what you're doing, you're probably going to end up looking up a guide if you don't have the entirety of the game memorized the way I do. But the fun of managing your inventory and resources is still very much present in this version. they kinda pulled it off. This is a very functional survival horror experience on the NES, which is a genre that pretty much doesn't exist on the platform outside of Sweet Home. It even contains a fully functional typewriter, limited saving, and item box system. All of those mechanics are faithfully preserved here. Although, when you pick up ink ribbons in this game, you get 6 per spawn. And all the spawns are the same, they're in all the same places they are in the original, but you get 6 per pickup, which is entirely too many. You can save any time that you do anything important, it doesn't matter. You will never run out. And you'll probably want to as well, because combat in this game can be weirdly brutal. It's very kill instantly or be killed instantly if you biff your timing. I wouldn't say it's hard necessarily. If you get the timing of the back and forth, it's always the same, it never changes. You can generally kill enemies before they even get a swing at you. Because every combat starts with the enemy far away from you, letting you get a few shots in before they are actually able to attack you, during which time you can usually eliminate them if you're good. This is a mechanic that seems to be pasted from Gaiden, but not the part that actually makes it work. You see, in Gaiden, you can preemptively initiate combat by aiming your gun at the enemy, and this is a thing you can do in this NES port as well. However, it doesn't seem to actually do anything. Regardless of whether or not you start a fight by pointing your gun at an enemy or running straight into them, the enemy always starts at this further range. Whereas in Gaiden, if you ran straight into an enemy, the fight would start with them in your face and they'd kill you for it. So there isn't really much of a point to trying to start fights from a distance on purpose. You might as well just try and run past everything, and if you fail, well, you'll get into a fight. As far as I can tell, there's also no running away from combat, so if you end up in a fight with no ammo, you're just dead. But at the very least, pausing the game mid-fight to go into the inventory to use a healing item or reload your gun is a free action, unlike in Gaiden where you're getting punched in the face the entire time you're doing this. Navigating around the space is pretty breezy, Jill runs quite fast, although the camera is interesting in this version. Perhaps in an attempt to replicate the fixed camera angles of the original, you very often can't see what you're doing, as the game will only show you a tiny portion of the room you're in. No, I don't actually think this is an attempt to replicate the fixed camera angle at all. It's a scrolling problem. You can kind of fix it by getting towards the edge of the screen and, like, fidgeting Jill there, strangely, to get more of it on screen properly, but it often means that as you're advancing through rooms, you run into enemies constantly that appear at the screen edges, forcing you into fights you might otherwise have been able to avoid. Sadly, the shotgun trap and the accompanying Jill sandwich line seems to be completely absent from this version. You can just walk into the room and grab the shotgun and leave and nothing happens. Sad. The biggest problem I faced during this first half of the game, and really the entire game, is that you can't combine like items in the inventory. As in, if you have 2 sets of pistol ammo, you can't combine them into one greater set, which makes carrying around large quantities of ammo quite difficult. And by the end of the game, my item box was just polluted with clips that had 1 or 2 bullets left in them that I couldn't really do anything with. Additionally, keys don't use themselves automatically, and when you've opened every door that uses a key, it does not discard automatically. You have to dump it at a box, or it's gonna sit there in your inventory forever. It's the little things, but I spent a whole lot more time interacting with the item box than I thought I was going to. I'm impressed the item box system even exists in this version of the game at all, so I'm not that mad about it, but every time I interact with this thing, it sounds like a little laser fight show going off, and it did get to me after a while. Speaking of music, the same song plays for 90% of the game, and I think it's a 20-second loop at most. It really bores into your skull over the course of the playthrough. While this port is surprisingly faithful overall in terms of content, one of the more striking omissions is that the Yawn boss fight is completely gone, instead being replaced with this generic spider enemy. Although I don't recognize this sprite, it might be original, but probably not. In fact, if you recognize any of the materials used in this video, please leave a comment. Dogs, incidentally, are represented, although this appears to be a digitized version of one of the CG cutscenes from the original. While this game is impressive for a bootleg, it is still a bootleg after all, it's not the highest budget thing in the world. But since we're in the courtyard now, this is the first place where we find a blue herb, and I'm happy to report that herb mixing is completely represented in this version of the game. Red, green, and blue, all 3 types. However, if you do mix herbs, it becomes impossible to tell in the inventory what version of the mixed herb you're carrying because all of the item sprites are brown. But really, I'm just impressed this mechanic is in this version of the game at all. And yes, blue herbs, which means poison is present, and what's more, it's actually more dangerous than it's ever been in any version of Resident Evil, because poison can kill you in this one. You can just be walking around and fucking drop dead on the spot. It's not that big of a concern though, since like the original, very few things actually can poison you. Most of them located in this guardhouse section of the game, which, true to the original, has all of its rooms intact and has all of its enemy types intact. In fact, enemy variety in this game is generally better than it ever was in Gaiden, which only ever had regular zombies for you to fight. Here we've got dogs, bees, spiders, the shark things. You can fight the sharks in this version. Even Plant 42 is represented with this sprite, blatantly stolen from one of the Zelda Game Boy games. Unfortunately, I couldn't check if V-Jolt was still in this version of the game because the room that you would make it in is password locked. The puzzle has changed from the PS1 version, and due to some kind of bug or another, I wasn't able to view any of the files I picked up, which are all still here, but I assume it's an issue with the translation patch or something, because every time I tried to view one, the screen would just go black. The void. So I have no idea what the password is. Defeating Plant 42 with a bunch of well-placed howitzer rounds, it's a howitzer now, not a bazooka, gets us the helmet key. And you know how I said you need the flow of Resident Evil 1 memorized to make sense of this? Remember how in the original there was a cutscene that explicitly tells you to go back to the mansion and check one more time? That does not happen in this version. Although when we do go back, we do find that the place is now populated with hunters. Just like in the original, although I don't think they're as threatening as the original, since they plod around pretty slowly. The second fight with Yorn in the piano room is also missing. When you approach the hole, Barry just runs in behind you, hands you a passcode, and then immediately leaves. Like, okay man. A similar omission is the Black Tiger spider boss in the caves, although they have replaced it with a slightly more interesting little spider maze thing you gotta work through to get a knife to cut the webs off the door. These are the cutest changes, I think, where things aren't simply missing but have been replaced with more sort of low-tech versions of the set piece to suit the hardware. It's just endearing, man. I was grinning from ear to ear all the while playing through this. The multiple choice ending stuff with Barry in the cave seems to be missing in this version, although curiously, you can still find the MO discs. So saving Chris is still on the table. In fact, when we get to the labs, you can use the MO discs on the passcode generators, all in the same place that they were in the original. Genuinely every room is here. But before we can use those, we gotta fight the Tyrant, who breaks out of his tube and starts immediately just zooping all over the place. It's honestly terrifying. He goes down like a chump to a mere handful of grenade rounds, though. In general, this version of the game is not very hard, which probably ameliorates a lot of the potential frustration from the item management and bumping into enemies at the edges of the screen. And after beating Tyrant, once again, you just have to know to walk all the way back to the entrance of the labs to get to the heliport, because the game isn't gonna tell you anything. There's no cutscene or event to impress any urgency on you, and it's pretty plausible that someone would just wander around here not sure what they're doing if they didn't have any knowledge of the original. You can, in fact, free Chris at this juncture if you have the 3 MO discs, and you do get a short little scene of him and Jill reuniting, although this doesn't seem to actually change the ending in any meaningful way. The scene exists, and the optional room exists, but this game doesn't actually have a concept of multiple endings. It's very odd like that. And going to the helipad, the rocket launcher spawns in immediately, although if the Tyrant zooping all over the place taps you before you can pick it up, you will be thrown into the fight without it. But it turns out you don't actually need it to win the fight, so it's not a big deal. And that's Resident Evil for NES, a charming and endearing bootleg that I had a pretty good time with. My playthrough was pretty brief, clocking in at about an hour and a half, but also I know Resident Evil 1 quite well. I wouldn't call it an outstanding game by any means, but I would say that if you're a Resident Evil superfan, this is more than worth spending an afternoon with. I was very taken by its faithful and surprisingly detailed representation of the entire campaign of the original game on a Famicom, far less capable technology than the PS1. My hat is off to Mars Production for this weird little curiosity from a bygone time. And I hope you enjoyed this video. I just wanted to share this weird and wonderful bootleg with you guys today. Maybe we could take a look at some more sometime. If you have any particularly interesting ones that you know of, please let me know. But otherwise, have a nice day. Bye-bye.